And there were some sacrifices, and there was danger, but there was moral clarity really throughout the population that it was the right thing to do, and they didn't hesitate. One of the main people in Hour of Need that was part of the inspiration was a math teacher. But the resistance extended down to, my mother as a 6-year-old girl.
For many people in the world, there is a moment of clarity when you see the world differently than you saw it previously. Those are the moments when we wake up to life. I'm Rabbi Josh Bennett, and this is Waking Up to Life, a podcast about those moments. I am so excited today to welcome Ralph Shayne to the podcast. Ralph is, by his own admission, a serial entrepreneur who has been working in the private equity industry, but more recently, and more germane to our conversation today, is a brand new author, the author of a new graphic novel called Hour of Need. He'll tell us more about the content, but just for context, it is the story of his mother's life growing up in Denmark and experiences around the Holocaust. Ralph, it is so important that I'm having you on the show, and so lovely that you've agreed to join.
Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed listening to your podcast, and I'm grateful to be included.
Great. Well, I know that you, in choosing to write this novel, had a moment of clarity, but I'd love for you to share how you got here. How did you make this decision, going from private equity into being a first-time author is not necessarily the straightest line, but share with the audience a little bit about your journey and what the moment of clarity was for you.
Sure. So I grew up understanding little bits and pieces of my mother's childhood story, which goes back to when she was a child and around 5 years old when the Germans occupied Denmark, and just turning 9 when she suddenly had to evacuate because there was rumor that broke that the Nazis were going to round up Denmark's Jews. And I knew that she got stowed away on a fishing boat and was saved and made it to Sweden, where she then lived as a refugee for a few years. And I knew there was remarkable components to this story, but never really engaged with my grandparents about it. I did have my uncle who would talk about it and kept a diary and shared it with me. But it took years to really appreciate the story and want to uncover it. And I read bits and pieces of anecdotes from back then that always struck me as remarkable about how these ordinary people just made this, with moral clarity, decision just to help their neighbors when they could have done nothing, and really rallied as a country to help evacuate the Jews in their moment of need. And one special thing really stood out along the way, which is when I started to learn more and more about the Danish resistance and felt, not is there just a chronology here, but there's really something special here.
So most people likely do not know the story of the Jews of Denmark, which, as you alluded to, is very different from much of the other stories that we hear about the Holocaust. And it starts actually at the very top of the royalty, where the King of Denmark made a declaration about the Jews of Denmark.
Yeah, I tried to pull it all together in what I wrote in Hour of Need in terms of the immediate personal stories of my family, the people that they met along the way, and then what happened really through leadership and the King of Denmark and the brave stance he took, and how he really became a symbolic leader for the country that helped with this decision of moral clarity. From my mother's standpoint, she didn't honestly actually even know she was Jewish when she would learn about her parents that they had to flee the country. And this was when her 9th birthday was approaching. So, word had gotten out that the Nazis planned to round up Denmark's Jews, 3 years into occupation. And when they thought they would be home celebrating the Jewish New Year of Rosh Hashanah back in 1943. There'd been I guess, a false sense of security in that 3 years the Jewish population had gone untouched, in part due to the leadership of King Christian X. And, suddenly my mother was a refugee on the run. My family spent 3 days searching for a way out of the country. And that's when people they had never met before risked their lives to hide them and stow them away on a fishing boat. And this was part of a greater communal effort where, in just a matter of a few weeks, over 700 trips were arranged between Denmark and Sweden to evacuate Denmark's Jews to safety, or most of Denmark's Jews to safety, including my mother.
It's a magical story of both bravery and communal, as you said, moral clarity. I can't help but think that it actually feels a lot like a fictional story, right? Somebody who hears this story says, everywhere else in the Holocaust, thousands, millions of Jews died. And now in this one country, almost everybody was saved. So I'm interested in when you chose to write your family's narrative, you made the decision to write it in the form of a graphic novel. Those of us who are scholars of the Holocaust probably have read Maus, which is another graphic novel on the subject. And I remember reading it for the first time and feeling a disconnect to the idea of this sort of graphic comic book nature and the seriousness of the subject. So how did you come to a graphic novel as the way to present your family story?
Well, let me first hit what you brought up about sort of the magical elements of the story. And, part of what inspired me is, well, first of all, I grew up with grandparents in Denmark and spent a lot of time in Denmark as a child. But Danish identity is not something that Americans know until you start introducing them to the things that are in their everyday life. And an important part of Danish culture is the fairy tale and Hans Christian Andersen. And people recognize The Little Mermaid. And part of that was the graphic novel gave me a format to introduce some of that mythology, which was very important. And there was mythology of this character well known to Danes, whose name is Holger Danske, which stands for Holger the Dane. And he's like a protector of the Danish people who, was a valiant warrior and mercenary hundreds of years ago, and is rumored to have gone into a long slumber in the basement of a Danish castle. And he dreams of Denmark and it being in peace and safe, and has vowed that if Denmark will ever be in danger, that he would rise up and strike a mighty blow to protect it. So this is sort of the backstory. And when I started connecting that, I knew there was this person whose grave that my uncle would visit every year, and that he was part of the Danish resistance, and that this Danish resistance group was called Holger Danske, was named after this character. So there was this tie of someone who's going to be there to protect people in their hour of need, which is what the Danish resistance did, and helped get my mother and family on the boat. So that was like the magical backdrop. In terms of choosing the graphic novel, I think it's just a beautiful format to make a story accessible and to bring the emotional content there that just the written word doesn't always do, and that the pictures really capture it. Now, there was some cultural divide there between survivors in my family not being comfortable with the use of this novel, this format, and what we were able to produce, and put a high bar. But I'd seen it being successfully used, and it's a way to make the story accessible. Is the way I would put it to all ages.
And you're not the first person to use the graphic novel. We talked about Maus, but you also had another inspiration that sort of brought to light this idea that a graphic novel can take difficult subjects and make them more approachable to people of all ages, correct?
Yes. I had a touchpoint intersection with Congressman John Lewis. He came and spoke at my children's school about an amazing graphic novel that he co-wrote about his life growing up as and becoming a civil rights leader called March. It's now turned into a trilogy and is being used to teach civil rights education in schools across the country. And it's a very powerful book to make the subject accessible. And I actually had one other intersection that I'd like to relate to with someone else who brought it into context. So, growing up for a while, and still now, I became a fan of the rap group Run DMC. And I actually met at a Comic-Con when I was trying to find a sponsor for my project, Daryl McDaniels, who's the DMC in Run DMC. And he now has a comic book line called Daryl Makes Comics. And he was on a panel and spoke about how he grew up and comic books helped him understand his environment and spoke to him and his creative aspirations, and how he felt comic books are a powerful way for a young person and an older person to want to sit down and have a conversation together, and that you're really opening up a topic to that. And I don't think there's a more powerful subject that could use intergenerational dialogue than explain the Holocaust to younger generations.
So before we go further, I have to say you've just aged both of us by using Run DMC as part of your inspiration. But I'm all in. I'm all in. People who are younger listening to this podcast are going to have to go onto the internet and find out who that is, so that they can be in touch with us. So when you were talking earlier about the magical Holger Danske and the legend that has mesmerized the Danish population, I was thinking that we, the Jews, have a protector model in our tradition, the golem, which is humanly created also, but by a rabbi, the Maharal, who sort of creates this Frankenstein-type personality using God's name as the key to unlock the power. But ultimately, that becomes dangerous. And ultimately, the people of that town are threatened such that the rabbi has to take the life away from that created energy. In this particular story, though, there's not a negative ending, right? The use of that legend leads to something special. And I think that that's really important for us to just talk about for a minute here. Sometimes we shy away from doing the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing. And that's an important quality of Jewish life, doing the right thing because it is the right thing to save lives. Pikuach nefesh is one of the most important values in our tradition. So just react to that for a minute.
Well, I think what was powerful here was it was the non-Jewish population that rose up to protect the Jewish population. And there were some sacrifices and there was danger, but there was moral clarity really throughout the population that it was the right thing to do, and they didn't hesitate. So one of the main people in Hour of Need that was part of the inspiration was a math teacher. His name was Sven Otto Nielsen. He's whose grave my uncle would visit, and now my cousin still visits once a year and lays flowers at. And he was a math teacher who felt he had to act, and he became part of that Danish resistance group, Holger Danske. And unfortunately, he did make the ultimate sacrifice in that, as did other people in the Danish resistance. But there are people throughout who, made a difference within their capabilities. So I would say that he was very equipped to be a stealth Danish resistance fighter, and was good with a firearm and could do clandestine operations. But the resistance extended down to, my mother is a 6-year-old girl who, she and her classmates went to school wearing the concentric circle blue, white, and red hats of the Royal Air Force as a sign of, opposition to the Germans who they had to walk by on their way to school. And when their parents thought that was too provoking, they changed their methods and they started just wearing dresses in color coordination with each other, but still showing the same thing. And that there's just many different ways that you can provide that type of resistance.
And it doesn't have to be something as giant as what happened there. In our modern society, it's okay for us to start thinking of ourselves as being the good people who are doing the right thing, who are taking care of other people. It's as simple, I don't want to minimize this, but it's as simple as what we teach our children. Open the door for somebody when you walk into a store and allow them to enter, or help somebody across the street who needs your help, or be a good neighbor. I know it's not the same story, but it starts with the way we behave every single day. And I think that that's really important to recognize.
And I think it plays a part in protest too, and how you protest, because letting situations become normal that shouldn't be, allows cruelty to fester. And, I've come to realize that when you go to a protest, you're not necessarily trying to send a message to the person you're protesting against. You're sending a message to the people standing to your left and right, or who might be sitting at home, that, there's a reason to react to this, which is what, I think these little girls did, that the message was to each other that we shouldn't just accept that walking by German soldiers and having them occupy our country is normal.
You made a decision to do this project not by yourself. You have partnered with the Illinois Holocaust Museum, who is part of the sponsorship of the book. And in addition, you, together with them, have created a series of modules and educational materials that can go out into the schools. So talk a little bit about that partnership, what your goals are with this book, and where you see us moving next. Why is this such an important project, not just for you telling the story, but for the whole world?
Yes, I also want to credit that I had a partner in a really talented Danish artist, Tatiana Goldberg, who did the illustrations and pour her heart into this project. And because of it, we actually won recognition as the comic book of the year in Denmark, and it translated into actually a Danish translation of the book that is over there. The museum has been an incredible sponsor. It gave me the confidence that there would be, I'd be able to reach an audience for this. They put together a 75-page study guide to accompany the book for teachers that want to introduce it into the classroom, as well as they have a program where they have what they call these trunks, teacher trunks, where any classroom that wants to have classroom copies on loan, and they cover all of the shipping costs to and from, can borrow a classroom set of the book to introduce it to the classroom. So, my hope is, like March, it'll get introduced into curriculums and be used as, I really think, it appeals to high school, but really like a middle school. It fills the gap between early introduction to the Holocaust, which some schools will use Number the Stars, which is also about Denmark. But for younger ages, this is a benign story for the most part, with important heroes and themes, and not the brutality, but more of the hope and what the human potential for good is, which I think is a great way to fill that gap until you start getting into the mouse and more heavy expositions of human cruelty and degradation.
And I will be linking at the bottom of this podcast, wherever it is available, wherever you get your podcasts. I'll link all of the information about the Illinois Holocaust Museum and how you can get the downloadable versions of material and that teaching trunk, so that if people are listening and want to connect, there's an opportunity to do that. And I haven't said this to you yet, but I've been thinking all along, you're not from Detroit, but your wife is from Detroit. And so I feel like I have an obligation to bring you in person. You're going to have to be here. You're going to have to teach this. And we want to get this into our curriculum here as well. That's really, really important. I think you mentioned it. There is a gap between what we tell our littlest students and what we teach our older students who are capable of hearing. And this really does fill a void that is so important as we start to tell the story of the Holocaust, now that there are almost no survivors left among us.
I would love to come back to Temple Israel. I've been there for family events, and I still have family that's active in your temple.
We're hoping that they're sharing this podcast freely over the next couple of days. So I can't help but think we're recording this at the end of Hanukkah, but it won't air until after Hanukkah is over next year, early sometime. But to me, there is a beautiful light that is coming from your work and the messaging of this book, because when we think of people who are in their hour of need, we all are capable of bringing that light. It's what the Maccabees did thousands of years ago, and our people have done over and over again throughout history. So just a last word, anything we missed that you can share about the project and about the work that you're doing?
Let me just bring up a couple of things based on what you just said. First of all, I didn't really share the full quote from Holger Danske that lays into the title, which is he says every year when he does a check-in with the Danish people to see if they're safe or not, to not forget him, because if they ever need him, he will be there for them in their hour of need, which, by the way, the Illinois Holocaust Museum helped sort of connect that, how relevant that was to Jewish ethos. In terms of what was different in Denmark, I would just like to just say a couple of things that really resonated with me. One was, we mentioned the King of Denmark. Having leadership accepting the Jewish population into the country made a huge difference. And going back into the early 1930s, he recognized that his neighbor in Germany had this anti-Semitic passion running through it. And he intentionally visited the Copenhagen synagogue in 1933 on its 100th anniversary to really show how the Jewish community was part of the Danish community. And it's also given me a lot of thought of privilege, what I like to equate to our discussions of like white privilege. The Danish people were treated a little bit differently than other countries because the Germans saw them as Aryan and very much like them. So they weren't as brutal to that population. And the population was more educated. And they had put them in the position to use that privilege that they had to protect this marginalized group. And that, to me, resonates why this is not just a Jewish story, but an obligation to all of us to think about these marginalized populations and how we have this same type of obligation to protect them, even if we're in a safe spot.
To that, I can only say amen. So it seems a little bit strange at the end of an interview with an author to ask this question, but it's something I ask literally every guest. Tell us what you're reading or watching right now. What is it that is inspiring you other than your own book, which we all will read now? What are you reading that's making you think about the world differently?
I'll go with the watching thing because, and this might not be as popular with your audience, but right now I've gotten very engrossed in the Chicago Bears season here. And, in part because it's just amazing how much leadership and a change of culture can be into inspiring people. And, we have the Lions to thank for bringing Ben Johnson over. And, he took the same people and turned them completely around with, getting them to believe in themselves. So, I think that is pretty amazing. And then something that I read a couple of years ago because of my son, who is very into past presidents and presidential biographies. Netflix has a recent series out about President James Garfield. And you don't find a lot of James Garfield fans out of there, but he actually had a pretty remarkable short span as an American president before he was shot 3 months into office. And what I think is kind of remarkable about that story is it's got this same theme of sort of unexpected responsibility because, if you watch it, what's really remarkable is the vice president, Chester Arthur, who was probably the least qualified and most corrupt person to be picked as a vice president just to get the ticket elected and never expected to be president, and how impacted he was by that responsibility and how he became an actual really responsible executive that made some consequential decisions for the good of the country.
So I'm giving you a pass on the first thing you said you're watching, because the
The Bears?
second thing you said you were watching was so good. So that's excellent. All of the
Death by Lightning. It's called Death by Lightning.
Death by Lightning.
Yes.
And the Chicago Bears season. Those are the two things. Yeah. And this is a terrible week for you to be talking about that, because we have virtually become eliminated at this moment. So
I feel your pain.
Well, I'm so grateful that you have been with me today. This story is a story that really needs to be told, and I'm thankful that you have begun the process of telling it, not only by writing the book, but by sharing the book with all of us. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, and look forward to visiting you in Detroit.
I look forward to that as well. To everyone who's listening, I hope you will find some time to read the book and be inspired by its message. And in the meantime, while you are living your life, I hope that you will find opportunities to do good in the world, to bring good to other people as you wake up to life.